Well, thank you for joining me again, Dr. Jason W. Morrison, theologist. We've got a little something I want you to look at.
Funny, he had a Porsche. He didn't come asking for help or anything. He came offering to help.
He was always a part of the game.
He was very charismatic. People liked being around him.
A lot of talk and
Mr. Cool.
very respectful.
Kind of like a grandfather type.
If we were playing tag, he was playing. If we were climbing trees, he was climbing trees with us.
A real upstanding, good kid.
He was a natural leader.
He was from my community.
He made himself the person who solved problems for people.
He'd worked with children all of his life.
It's not healthy to expect the worst in people, but child sexual abuse and boundary violations can come from people that we know personally. More than 80% of sexual abuse incidents happen in isolated, one-on-one situations with a child.
Things like someone who is really intensely child-focused. Somebody who spends all of their time with children or seems to, latch on to one particular child. That would be a behavior that would be concerning.
They're getting that child to stay after school and get one-on-one work with their homework.
Part of what I think we really miss when we think about sexual abuse is that women are perpetrators too.
Through the grooming process, you're facing escalating abuse, escalating violence, and it's being alternated with rewards. Your uncle comes over, he asks you to sit on his lap, you sit on his lap, he gives you love, and that feels really good. And then the next day he comes over, you sit on his lap, he gives you love, and that feels really good, but then he puts his hand on your leg, right? And then you go out for ice cream.
So if you eliminate or reduce these isolated, one-on-one situations, you'll dramatically lower the risk.
And I'll put the link to this site below. So, getting to the problem, to the main issue of religion and crime, it comes from people thinking that there's something they need to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad. It comes from people thinking that they're doing good to make God happy or stop him from being sad, not realizing this is the power that initiates their sinful nature. Now, whether we want to believe this or not is irrelevant. If you're a Christian and you follow the Bible, this is what the Bible says. Good can produce death. Trying to keep the law cannot save from sin. It produces sin. The law was given to the Hebrews over 4,000 years ago, or whatever it was, and it was finished 2,000 years ago for righteousness, never to be followed again. It was never given to Gentiles or Philistines or anyone like that. It was given to the Jews. It wasn't given to the Egyptians. They never followed the Mosaic law. It wasn't given to the Chinese. It wasn't given to the Americans. It was given to the Jews. And it was finished 2,000 years ago. But us silly Westerners, I'm going to say that again, us silly Westerners come into Christianity and we want to do our best, and the first thing we start to do is follow the law. And that's a catastrophe. This can happen later in your journey, but one of the first things you need to talk about or realize or learn about is grace. Now, I don't want to go into that. I just want to focus on the main problem and the reason behind this, which is the law is good, but it produces death in us. In other words, it's the power behind our sin. 1 Corinthians 15:58. Sin is the power the law is the strength of sin. Sin gets its power from the law. And not enough people realize this. They don't want to make the effort to try and understand how dangerous this is. And I'm flabbergasted at how little people know about the dangers of the law in people's lives. If we go on a little bit further, one of the ways in which this increments and increases, you have to ask yourself, and this is what all believers have to ask themselves, am I getting this wrong? Am I getting my beliefs wrong? Well, I would say to some degree that you are, and if you are, you need to be concerned, and if you're not concerned, then you are one of the ones that are going to go down the slippery dip into the mud at the bottom and knock over everybody standing there, along with yourself. For we know that the law is spiritual. Okay, the law is spiritual. But I am carnal, sold under sin. So he's making the statement that the problem's not the law. Okay, let's make that clear. The law in itself is holy, good, and just in every spiritual aspect of the words. But there's a power in us, there's a nature in us that cannot come out from under sin via the law. Let me say that. It cannot come out from under the influence of sin via the law. The law cannot help, fix, stop, repair, or anything like that, the sin inside a person. It just can't do that. Paul goes a little bit further and he says, for what I am doing, this was under the law. What I was doing, I do not understand. That's where it starts to infiltrate. It incrementally overtakes the mind, so that the mind shifts from its moral compass, knowing the measures of what sin is, to not knowing or sensing that it's beginning to infiltrate the senses and the feelings and make itself attractive inside the person's mind. That's what sin does. It makes itself attractive. It even makes death attractive. That's why many people under stress and duress and depression and anxiety will go through and commit suicide, because suicide, whilst they might be crying while they're doing it, becomes an attractive solution to probably 9 times out of 10 a fixable problem. Because what does sin want to do? It wants to produce death, and it'll do whatever it has to make that happen. Now, Paul goes on, for what I will to do, he's saying, my intention was to do good. That I do not practice. So it's a confession of evil, isn't it? I wanted to do good, and I didn't understand why I wasn't, and then I realized it was trying to keep the law that caused me to do what I hate. Now, many of you people are having this in a conflict in your spirituality. You're trying to keep God happy and stop him from being sad. You're doing things you don't understand. You're willing to do good, but in its entirety, you're not practicing it. As a matter of fact, some things you're doing, you hate. And you have to be honest with yourself, like Paul's come to the place. We all come to this place where we go, I just don't want to do this anymore. Something's not right. You might be getting angry. You might all of a sudden just be getting angry, or you might just be, coming under the influence of people that are using you and abusing you. There might be things in your life that you can change before you were a Christian and can't change now. There's torments and things that you're battling within yourself that are unresolved and won't be resolved while ever you're trying to force change, which is what law does. It's not a flow. It's not fluid. It just forces everything on people, and they haven't got the 9 times out of 10 the staying power to be able to cope with those forces. So Paul says, if then I do what I will not to do, if I'm doing things I don't want to do. It sounds like a cop-out, isn't it? But it's a desperate testimony, it's a desperate confession to what the law causes inside our being. The sinful nature wants us to think that there's something we need to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad, so that it can get its grip over us and make us start to lose our understanding and to not practice what we want to and to do what we hate. This is what's happening to these people. And if then you do what you don't want to do, I don't know what just happened then. If you do then what you don't want to do, if you're doing something that you don't want to practice, contrary to what you believe and are trying to do, you're doing the opposite, then obviously something inside you has overcome you. Now a lot of people might say, well, it's demons. Well, partly could be, but unless you understand that there's an evil nature inside of you, no matter how wonderful and pretty you think you are and how moral you think you are, you still have a sinful nature. That's all there is to it. But Paul comes to the place where he says, if then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good, but now it is no longer I who am doing it, but sin that dwells in me. Can you come to that place where you can say, sin dwells in you? Can you? Because if you can find a way out. If you can't, you're in serious, dire trouble. Marriages have been lost. Friendships have been lost. Lives have been lost. Families have been and are being broken to pieces. People are being broken into pieces. They're being punished for not following these organizations' doctrines. They're being shunned, abused. That's theological abuse. Theological abuse, whilst not sexual abuse or that kind of intrusion, is a very harmful form of religious criminal crime. Theological abuse. It's criminal. It's using something that has authority by nature over a person and using it in the wrong way upon a person. And this is where accountability is often, and responsibility, negated. Because usually the people that are dishing this kind of abuse out are in authoritative roles. So again, we haven't read much into this. We've only gotten to the 17th verse, and it's quite clear that the writer is desperate, absolutely desperate to get out the message that the law of Moses, whilst it is good for those that are going to attack me for saying that it causes sin, the law is good. The problem's not the law. You need to stop, you critics, and understand that there's an evil nature in us that is fueled by us trying to keep the law, which by definition, my definition, is anything we think we need to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad, alongside of or outside of the finished work of Christ. It's dangerous. If we look at the research aims and objectives when it comes to certain principles towards perpetrators and sexual abuse. There is so much information amongst this technology that we have no excuse not to bring these people into some kind of accountability. If you look at for instance, take the area of self-generated images and peer offences. Peer-on-peer online facilitated sexual abuse. This is what I'm going to read to you. Peer-on-peer online facilitated sexual abuse. Though there is extensive literature about contact peer-on-peer sexual abuse among children, there is as yet little empirical research into online peer sexual abuse among children and young people. So it's still an area of ignorance that hasn't been completely explored and brought to light. And then we've got sexting and CSA. A limited number of studies retained through the Rapid Evidence Assessment Scrutiny process discussed sexting. Victims can suffer a spiral of loss of control due to sexting, whereby user-generated contact made by young people and placed on the internet can lead to far-reaching consequences for young people, including becoming a victim or being labelled a perpetrator. So that's my latest installment. So just have a quick look at this. It goes for 3 minutes. I'll see you in the next talk on the reason behind religious crime.
Hello, my name is John Brown. I'm Head of Development and Impact at the NSPCC. As part of our focus on preventing child sexual abuse, I'm delighted to have with me today Professor Richard Wortley from the Giordano Institute. Richard, could you tell us a bit about the Giordano Institute and your interest in this area of preventing child sexual abuse?
Sure. Well, the Giordano Institute at UCL is an institute that's devoted specifically to the problem of preventing crime before it starts. In terms of prevention, there's been very little about primary prevention. In other words, trying to stop child sexual abuse before it occurs. A lot of what we've been doing has been to work with offenders once they're caught. The place-based approach that we adopt at UCL recognises that for any crime to occur, including child sexual abuse, you need actually 3 things. You need an offender, and you certainly need to be able to do things with the offender. You also need a victim, and you also need a location for where that offence takes place. And so our work is about how can we intervene in those other areas as well to increase safety. So we broadly call that a place-based approach where our aim is to create safe locations for children.
Can you tell us a bit more about that and what's termed situational prevention?
Right. Situational prevention is about looking at the places where potential offenders and potential victims, children, congregate or come together and trying to examine the areas of vulnerability there and trying to reduce those. There are hot places and hot times. And if we examine those places and times, it can give us really good information about what makes those places vulnerable. What we've learned and need to recognise is that the potential to perpetrate child sexual abuse extends much further back into the normal curve than it's comfortable for us to think about. And we know that when we look at who the offenders are and the relationship between offenders and victims. We know that in most cases, the majority of cases, offenders and victims have pre-existing relationships before the abuse occurs.
What more preventative work do you think can be done that we think does work with children and families to prevent the opportunity of them being targeted and abused?
So the parent does have a capacity to develop or learn to apply more effective guardianship strategies with their child. And that's probably one of the only ways that we can get into the family home to make that a safer place for people.
Can you talk a bit more about what a public health approach to sexual abuse prevention means?
Victims, how we can provide better guardianship for potential victims. We need to think about how we can make the places safer.
And of course, Richard, we all have a role to play in the prevention of child sexual abuse, whether we are family members, parents, professionals and government as well. Child abuse is everyone's issue and everyone's concern, and everyone can be involved in its prevention.